Hello there! We continue ranking all Spider-Man video games with the help of my Stasic scoring system, which you can read about in the pinned comment if you like. We have reached 2012, when a new Spider-Man movie was released, a reboot no less, and of course that means a number of tie-in video game releases. Will these games be able to reach the quality of some of the older titles? Let's find out. The new mainline Spider-Man game was handled by Beanox, and one thing that's noticeable pretty immediately is just how cinematic it feels in pretty much every action. The camera angles, the animations, the sound effects, they all form an experience that feels exciting even when performing something smaller and more mundane. And that's a big part of the illusion that makes the game work, because otherwise gameplay lacks depth in a lot of areas. And it's not that it's implemented badly or has a bad core, it's just shallow. If you take swinging for example, yeah, the camera may be a bit close to the character, but also without such an angle, the animation-based swinging that lacks physics and momentum would be really noticeable. This way, it's more hidden. The web rush mechanic transforms half of the navigation into a point-and-click game devoid of interaction, but it happens with really cool animations. Likewise with stealth, it's really basic and after some upgrades becomes really easy, but the animations are just so good. Combat as well, there's barely any depth to the fight system except that enemies with guns pose a real threat, so it would be best to prioritize them, but still there's not a lot of actions or strategies that you're going to use. Bosses are also exceptionally basic, but it all looks really cool. Still, there's only so much enjoyment one can get from good-looking, shallow gameplay. But don't worry, The Amazing Spider-Man is a well-structured game that makes sure to give you a constant surge of new types of things to do. Just on a high level, after the tutorial, your first mission is to fight a giant robot, which then eventually leads to following a rat infestation across New York that then culminates in a giant robot snake battle. And that's just the middle of the campaign. Yeah, the game clearly forgoes the more grounded approach to the character and the universe that the Amazing Spider-Man movie was trying to take. On the way to your next objective, you'll find tons of comic book collectibles to get, and these unlock not just covers, but actual full comic books for you to read. And quite honestly, I found that exciting, especially considering that practically every issue is somehow connected to villains that you'll find in the game. And your objectives include taking pictures of your adoring fans, stealing tech upgrades from Oscorp, uncovering conspiracies, webbing gang cars, and surfing on robot hunter pieces with absolutely zero regard for human safety, while your character's costume will get visibly damaged the more you fight. There's some character drama that contextualizes the story in a more or less interesting way, though the animation that looks good in gameplay doesn't really represent human faces and emotions well, and it doesn't help that writing is often cringy and sometimes doesn't make sense. Like for example how Gwen literally has absolutely zero regards to Spider-Man's secret identity when she talks to him from the Oscorp quarantine zone, though in a way that's in line with the game itself, having zero regards to spoilers. It takes place after the events of the movie and doesn't try to hide anything that happened, which actually is a move I can appreciate. I also appreciate the originality of how some villains from Spider-Man's Rogue Gallery are introduced to this version of the universe, and the final post-story ending with Smythe was quite effective. But all that said, the Amazing Spider-Man game is not for me. I am one of those that thinks the movie is underrated, so it would be in my best interests to enjoy this title as well, and while I will admit that it is a well-structured and quite polished game with a lot of effort put into making sure you won't get bored, its gameplay systems are too shallow for my personal enjoyment, so I will assign a Stasic rating of 59. It is clear that The Amazing Spider-Man was made with care, otherwise there wouldn't be a mode where you swing around the city collecting script pages and fighting crime as Stan Lee himself. And it's got quite a lot to offer to people who would be interested in the type of experience the game provides. But I wasn't quite feeling it. The Amazing Spider-Man is a fine game, it's just not a game for me. Nintendo users wouldn't see new open-world Spider-Man gameplay until the 2013 Wii U release. The versions that Wii and 3DS have got are essentially the Amazing Spider-Man with a mission structure instead of an open-world one, some additional arbitrary minigames during console interactions, and a less polished version of the game's mechanics. Enjoyment of the Amazing Spider-Man hinges on the cinematic nature of its gameplay and the variety provided by the open-world structure. When you take that out and pretty much focus only on the already shallow mechanics that in these versions are also clunkier to use and not as cinematic, you get a game that's just Not to mention, while the story is the same technically speaking, there's a lot of dialogue and events missing because it is related to the open world part that was cut out, so the narrative is much more confusing. And yeah, not only character faces look very weird and robotic, overall the whole game feels haphazardly put. Wii games can look very good, and while this one doesn't look bad per se, very often it falls into an uncanny valley of sorts. Consequences of having to cut down from a much more technically advanced version rather than building for the platforms in question. Now, for the purposes of thoroughness, I need to mention that the 3DS version has a full Vigilante side mode that no other versions have. And considering that I've been creating separate entries for far smaller differences than that, you might wonder why 3DS is put together with the Wii. Well, it's because Vigilante mode is this. An absolutely ignorable, separately accessed strategy metagame that's really not interesting at all. I don't think its presence changes the experience in any way, be it positive or negative. So, these ports of the Amazing Spider-Man get a Stasocritic rating of 39. They're playable, that's for sure, but they lack what made the main version of the game properly enjoyable. The Amazing Spider-Man game by Other Ocean takes as a base their Edge of Time title, and I have to wonder how late Activision contacted them to develop a new game, because not only did it barely improve upon Edge of Time in terms of core gameplay, it's even worse as an overall experience. The Amazing Spider-Man is a collection of randomly generated levels, where to get from one section to another you have to beat randomly placed enemies until one of them drops a key card. That's the entire game. I'm not saying random generation is bad, but it takes a lot of effort to make it work properly. Here, levels are literally random with no proper pacing or feeling of progression or anything. The combat system isn't any more engaging than it was in Edge of Time. I will assign a Stasocritic rating of 32. The game is not rage-inducing, and that's about the only reason to play it. Pity. Gameloft's The Amazing Spider-Man for smartphones has some of the cheesiest and cringiest Spider-Man voice acting I have ever heard.
Don't they know that money tastes terrible barbecued? I'll handle this. And remember, try meeting a science nerd.
What do we got here? I think the freak show is down at Coney Island, kid.
Am I supposed to laugh at that one? I just popped in to introduce myself. The name's Spider-Man, creep, and you'll be thinking about me a lot from inside of a jail cell.
You're gonna be sorry you messed with us, Spider Freak. Robbing this bank may be all about business, but we're gonna take you out for free.
For free, you say? And here I was all worried because I left my spider wallet in the other costume.
I think I'm more annoyed by this performance than the Web of Shadows one. I don't know, it's difficult to decide. Anyway, the game itself is an admirable attempt to put an open-world Spider-Man experience onto smartphones, though the microtransaction economy that's present is weird and doesn't fit. There's not much else to say about this game, really. It attempts to recreate all the standard Spider-Man open-world stuff, except the physics-based swinging, of course. The controls are okay, but sort of clunky, the combat system is adequate, missions are fine, though can get a bit repetitive. it's an acceptable game that will get a Stasucritic rating of 43. It's interesting from the perspective of being an open-world game on mobile phones, and at the time you would not be able to find a Spider-Man phone experience like that, but when taken on its own merits, outside of that innovation factor, it doesn't have much to offer. The Amazing Spider-Man by Gameloft, like Toxic City before it, is one of those Java games that can come in many forms. Like a game trying to fit everything on a resolution smaller than that of Game Boy, or maybe something more advanced. But even what you see now is not the full version, it's actually this, which also exists in several variations. Like with Toxic City before it, there's going to be an entry just for this fullest version of the game, as searching for all variations that were cut down in different ways depending on how weak the phone would be is an exercise in futility. Since I've mentioned Toxic City several times already, it's worth noting that The Amazing Spider-Man is a brawler clearly based on it, and there is a considerable number of gameplay improvements. There is more combos that include fun things like swinging webbed opponents left and right like a sledgehammer, there's more possibilities related to webbing in general, you can throw your enemies right onto your phone's glass, quick-time events are more action-packed, and there's a couple of arcade levels where you're road surfing while attached to a truck. So even though the story feels like it's a useless appendix that barely tells a connected tale involving Sandman, Venom and the Lizard, which doesn't really relate to the movie at all, this feels like it should be a game that's at least as fun as Toxic City was, right? Well, there is one problem, but it's so prevalent that it hampers the entire gameplay experience. And it's most noticeable with bosses because those pack the biggest punch. Enemy collision persists even some time after their attack animation ends. This means that quite often you get what essentially are ghost hits when approaching an enemy. And I don't know if it's a problem with absolutely all versions of the Amazing Spider-Man, again, there's so many, but it's been present one way or another in every variant I checked. Sadly, this is why the Amazing Spider-Man for mobile phones is getting a Stasucritic rating of 59. Even though by most parameters it is a considerable gameplay improvement over Toxic City, I couldn't enjoy it as much because this hit detection problem was just too annoying. There have been 5 games based on the first Amazing Spider-Man movie, and only 2 of them are worthy of recommendation, and even then with some caveats to keep in mind, they are certainly not titles that everyone would enjoy. Is this the beginning of the decline of Spider-Man games? Or will the titles that follow the Amazing Spider-Man 2 movie manage to somehow salvage the situation? We'll find out in the next video.
The happy faces of residents no longer afraid to walk the streets prove once again why he's called your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.